Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX and I'm Megha Sharma. After an entire year of dubious allegations, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau yesterday acknowledged that the government did not have concrete evidence regarding the death of the Khalistani terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil, and he testified before a public inquiry into the foreign interference in federal electoral processes and democratic institutions in Ottawa, talking about how the government had, in contrast, intelligence reports on which it was acting. In a sharply worded statement, India called out Prime Minister Trudeau's quote-unquote cavalier attitude and affirmed that this is what India has been saying from the start, that the Trudeau government has not shared a shred of hard evidence to back its allegations. Justin Trudeau is facing trouble back home too. The leader of People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier, has accused Justin Trudeau of being the man behind deteriorating the diplomatic ties with a rising world power, which is India, in the process of shielding a foreign terrorist. He further asserted that Hardeep Singh Nijjar's citizenship should be revoked posthumously. Joining me on the telecast today is Elcock, who's the former Deputy Minister of National Defence in Canada. He's also the former Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Thank you very much for joining me, Mr. Elcock. And my first question to you about this souring of India-Canada ties, and you talk about this issue not about intelligence but about evidence. So why is it that the evidence has still not been shared by the Canadian government?
Your information is clearly inaccurate. The reality is that evidence has been shared with the Indian government. It was shared at a meeting in Singapore, and it's no longer an issue of intelligence, or even if that wasn't really an issue in the beginning. The reality now is that the RCMP have conducted investigations. They've made somewhere between 20 and 30 arrests. They developed information evidence as part of their inquiries, which indicated that Indian diplomats were participating in actions here in Canada. That information was provided to the Indian government in Singapore. What is now happening is the RCMP has laid charges. The Crown Prosecutor has obviously agreed to go forward. So there will be trials in some 20 or 30 cases, including more than one murder and a number of other crimes. So we're not talking about intelligence, we're talking about evidence, we're talking about prosecutions that will go forward.
But talking about, when Justin Trudeau has once again yesterday, while he was in his testimonial spoken to the Foreign Interference Commission, spoken once again that his government did not have evidence. In fact, they were working on the intelligence reports that were gathered. Time and again, I've heard that entire quote that he made.
The comment he made was with respect to the first announcement he made some months ago, a long time ago, in effect, in the passage of time. When the government made that announcement, it did it on the basis of intelligence. That doesn't mean that it is a questionable announcement. In my view at the time, that intelligence was probably very hard intelligence. Having seen intelligence collection sources before and knowing how it operates, I would suspect that intelligence was very hard intelligence.
Okay, let's take a look.
But we're not talking about intelligence anymore.
The
issue of intelligence is now irrelevant because we now are at an evidence stage. We're at a court trial stage.
Okay, since you're talking about the credibility of the evidence, let's also try to understand the issue of the credibility of Western governments. For example, you're aware of the former US Secretary of State Colin Powell sharing a presentation of evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq leading to an invasion of a sovereign nation. Now, whether Saddam Hussein was an evil man or not, but the world has been told about your evidence in the past, which simply was just a bunch of lies. Therefore, do you then recognize that there is in fact an issue of credibility when Western countries come out and state that they have quote-unquote credible evidence against a certain country or a head of state?
I understand that people are concerned about issues that are based on actions that are taken on the basis of intelligence, but all governments, including, I suspect, the Indian government, take actions on the basis of intelligence. Having said that, as I said before, this is not the case of Colin Powell, where Colin Powell was putting forward intelligence to the UN. This is now the case of 20 or 30 prosecutions which will go forward before the Canadian courts. The RCMP has collected evidence. It's put it to the Crown Prosecutor. The Crown Prosecutor has approved those prosecutions. There will be 20, 30 prosecutions, including more than one homicide and including a number of other crimes, with which there will be evidence of Indian diplomats having been associated.
It's interesting you've mentioned about the RCMP and then the CSIS and their investigations and then their comments and their revelations that they've made. And you yourself have headed CSIS, and you'll be aware of the John Major report of your investigation into the Kanishk bombings in 1985. And let me refresh your memory of Volume 2, Paragraph 1.4, and I quote that the Duncan blast occurred 3 weeks prior to the bombing of Air India Flight 182. There were 2 CSIS surveillance following Talvinder Singh Parmar, Inderjeet Singh Ryat, and a third unidentified person to the woods near Duncan, British Columbia, where they heard a large explosion. The senior surveillant believed it was the sound of a gun being discharged, although the younger surveillant thought it to be a much greater noise that lifted her off her car seat. Parmar and Ryat were allowed to continue on their way, and the third person was never identified. Unquote. Terrorists literally conducted a trial run of a bombing right under your nose and of your agents. Did the CSIS fail to identify the Khalistani threat that led to the largest terror attack in the history of the world since 9/11?
Well, in fact, it occurred before 9/11, so 9/11 is still the biggest. Look, nobody I think is happy with the results of the investigation into Air India, but frankly, that has absolutely nothing to do with the issue at hand. The reality is the RCMP, these are standard criminal investigations that the RCMP has conducted. They have gone to the Crown Prosecutor, and the Crown Prosecutor has obviously looked at the evidence and assessed it as being credible. And credible enough that he's prepared to go to trial on it. So there will be 20 or 30 prosecutions.
I actually, I'm putting out and actually quoting the John Major report because we're talking about credibility, and we're talking about the credibility of RCMP, and we're talking about the credibility of the CSIS or the lack of it. Because here's another quote, and I'm going to mention this. It's had CSIS continued its operation on Vancouver Island, they could have gathered a great deal more information on the person that they believed to be the son of Parmar. The next day in Vancouver, the other CSIS surveillance noted that both of the Parmar's sons were dropped off at school. At a minimum, the surveillance would have had to come to the conclusion that the person they were following on Vancouver Island was not Jaswinder Parmar. The identity of the young man who accompanied Parmar and Ryat to the test blast has remained a key question and an active part of the police investigation, unquote. So how do you have to react to this? And rightly you say that, this is not related to the allegation being made by the Canadian government that there were Indian agents involved in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. But here I take a look back because there is a precedent that has been set. This was the biggest terror attack until 9/11 happened, and it has been quoted and underlined and highlighted how the CSIS and the RCMP were not capable of actually either deliberately skimming through evidence, not probing into the entire issue because of their laxity, because of, ignorance. I mean, what was going on?
The two cases have there's no connection between the two cases. I understand what you're trying to do, but there is no connection. And if you want to raise questions about credibility, then you'll simply have to wait for the prosecutions to go forward. The evidence will be put to the court, and there will be lawyers on both sides, and that prosecution will ultimately come to a conclusion. So we'll have to both wait and see what happens in those prosecutions. But in all likelihood, some of those individuals will flip and will provide testimony, and there will be evidence that will be uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Okay, all right. Let's also, I'm going to move on from the Kanishka bombing that happened, and thus far not one of the individuals, the terrorists who were involved in it, has been prosecuted. Now, the question about the acceptance of the Canadian government and the CSIS that there is a Khalistani threat today, which has been ignored by you at the loss of Canadian lives in the past. And I'm again specifically talking about the Kanishka bombing.
Clearly, in the past, there were issues with respect to Sikh terrorism. Having said that, the reality is that, as I understand it, and the government has been very clear in its statements, to the extent that the Indian government has provided evidence of current issues, and I mean current, not 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to the extent that the Indian government has provided evidence of terrorist acts at this point in respect of Canadians, that evidence has been, the evidence that the Indian government has provided has been deficient. It has not been sufficient to permit any prosecution or extradition. So it's nice that if the Indian government wants to put forward credible evidence, then I'm sure the government of Canada would pay attention to it. But if the government of India produces deficient evidence, then at the end of the day, it's not going to get what it wants. And I would make a further point. The reality is, I think some of what India alleges to be terrorist, frankly, is not in Canada terrorist. It is not, for example, contrary to the law in Canada, to support the independence of Quebec from Canada. And similarly, it is not in Canada a crime for someone to support the separation of Khalistani. So you need to have more than simple support for a concept.
Okay, I'm going to come back.
That evidence,
I am going to come back to it and talk about the Quebec referendum, and let's also discuss if there were separatists within the country, in our country, and there was a Quebec referendum, and there were.
But there is no crime.
There were members of parliament, there were ministers from our country who came out in wholehearted support for these kind of referendums, and then there would be pictures of diplomats from Canada being stuck. And a demand for their execution, death to these individuals, would that not be equated to terror acts?
Holding a referendum is not a crime on any subject.
Okay. I'm going to come back to it.
May be a crime. It may be a crime in India.
No, I'm saying that if there are separatist activities that are taking place, and again, I understand, I would like to.
Separatist activities do
I would like to also understand from over. Okay. I would like to understand the interesting choice of words that you've used, and particularly when you call quote unquote Sikh terrorism, and you refuse to acknowledge it and recognize it as Khalistani terrorism. Is there a reason?
I am sure if the government of India were to produce evidence that a Canadian citizen was engaged in terrorism, the government would take action. As I've said to you, the government of Canada has been clear. The government of India has not provided such evidence that would allow the government of Canada to take action. Does the government of Canada and do CSIS target terrorist actors in Canada? Of course they do. And I'm sure if there are Sikhs who are engaged in such activities, they would target them. Having said that, again, let me reiterate, unless the government of India produces evidence, then there is no.
But there was, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. In 1985, there was evidence that was provided, not just by India. There was a Justice Kirpal report that there was the John Major report that brought about into the massive lapses by the CSIS, by the RCMP, and actually identified who these individuals were, who these terrorists were, who orchestrated that entire terror attack. Would those not be called as clear, solid evidences?
Well, since the government of India didn't provide us any warning about Air India, they didn't know about it either. So the reality is that's an incident.
I will have to say, on the contrary, there was a report. I can share it with you. I could read it out verbatim. To the warnings as per intelligence sources by India that there could be those 2 flights that could have been attacked during those days when the attack happened. Okay, I'm going to move on. Why was the Pakistani government not warned about the operation to take down Osama bin Laden, which happened several decades ago? Now, are you now suggesting that Pakistan is a failed state that doesn't require warning, or was indeed a violation of Pakistan's sovereignty when Osama bin Laden was neutralized?
I really, that's not something I can really comment on, frankly. Not something Canada was engaged in or involved in, and I certainly wasn't involved in those issues, so I can't really comment on those issues.
Okay, I ask you because the Five Eyes that have come together and raised concerns over India's quote-unquote non-cooperation, and it was America which got intelligence and claimed that it had hard evidence, actually entered into the territory of Pakistan without even letting the government know. Was this not a violation of the sovereignty of the country?
At the end of the day, that's an American action. You would have to talk to the United States on those issues.
But do you have an opinion on it?
Pardon?
Do you have an opinion on it?
No, I don't. Those were actions taken by the United States government. They don't involve Canada, and they certainly didn't involve me.
Okay.
So I can't comment on them.
Okay. Okay, all right. I'm going to, we spoke about Quebec for a short period of time, and I'm going to come back to it. And you, as a citizen of Canada, are you in favor of independence of Quebec from the rest of the country?
Personally, no, I would not support the independence of Quebec, but at the end of the day, it's a perfectly legitimate thing for people to talk about, as long as they don't attempt to do it by violent means.
Okay. All right. I would also like to understand from you, like, would it be appropriate for us to carry effigies celebrating the assassination of John F. Kennedy? And I make this reference because there have been demonstrations that have happened on Canadian soil where the former Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, was seen being killed in the assassination that happened in 1984, and there have been these demonstrations that have been happening. There has been no action that has been taken by the Canadian government. And then would it be appropriate for any country or for India to then go about celebrating the assassination of Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy, or even in Canada, if such a thing were to happen, would the government and the law enforcement agencies take action?
I would not suggest that it is an appropriate thing to do, and I certainly would criticize it if it were to happen in Canada. Having said that, at the end of the day, it's not a crime. Unfortunately, you may wish it to be a crime, but it's not.
No, absolutely.
It's not a crime. It's not crime. It's not a crime in Canada for demonstrators to carry effigies of Mr. Trudeau.
You think it is not a crime to incite hate against a particular community in Canada?
Well, I'm not sure that that's inciting hatred against a community in Canada, because the target was not even a Canadian. And neither would be if there were to be demonstrations in India which hung an effigy of John F. Kennedy. There would be no Indian community either. It would be in respect of a foreign country. And I guess I would make the point that have probably been demonstrations in Canada in which Mr. Trudeau has been, if not hung in effigy, certainly dragged around in the street. But that's not a crime.
Okay, okay.
It
Fair
may
enough.
be inappropriate, but it's not a crime.
Okay, all right. Okay, all right. But then I'm going to also ask you now, would it be appropriate for Indian citizens or I don't know, a bunch of organizations, members of the organization, I don't know if they could be separatists or activists or whatever name you want to call them, to place hoardings demanding the execution of Canadian diplomats? How would the government of Canada react to such an act happening in India or any other part of the world actually?
There's really not much we could do about it if it happened. And if it's not a crime in India, then nobody is going to do much about it. The reality is there are criticisms leveled against foreign leaders frequently in demonstrations, and in this country, even domestic leaders. It happens. It's a reality, but it doesn't rise to the level of a crime.
So, but then are you at this point? Are you waiting that an Indian diplomat be assassinated and then take action?
I am sure there is more than adequate protection provided to Indian diplomats in Canada, the ones that haven't yet been expelled.
Okay, not that there have been Canadian diplomats, including the Charge d'Affaires and previously the High Commissioner, who unceremoniously left the country after the orders given by the government of India. Meanwhile, from an intelligence organization that failed miserably to investigate the worst terror attack, again the Kanishka bombing, were all the accused walked free into Canadian society. And would you tell us who is to be the judge and jury of your evidence?
Various courts in Canada.
The courts in Canada, but nothing substantial came out of it. In fact, there was every single one of those who was prosecuted.
Well, that's not entirely accurate, because that's not entirely accurate, because
either died or went scot-free.
You really need to keep your facts straight. The reality is Rayad did go to prison. Yes, there were a couple of other people tried, but they were successfully able to defend themselves. That is a conspiracy that unfortunately has never been broken. Having said that, that has absolutely nothing to do with, that happened 20 or 30 years ago. It has no bearing on what may or may not happen in the trials that are now about to happen with respect to 20 or 30 arrested individuals.
Okay, so are you saying that 30 years ago when the incident happened, the CSIS and the RCMP were not capable of actually probing into that entire terror case, and therefore because of negligence, or I don't know, was there collusion, whatever happened was the responsibility of the two agencies? They could not really deliver. But so are you saying that back then they were not capable, but after 30 years the situation within these organizations has changed dramatically?
I would say to you that is an incident that happened 20 or 30 years ago. It happened in very specific circumstances. I don't think it has any relevance to what happens today whatsoever. I am sure there will be people who will make the same comment as you're making. I don't share the view that it has any relevance, but I can't stop you from making the point. You're perfectly free to make the point. I just don't think it has any relevance. And the reality is there are going to be 20 or 30 trials in which 20 or 30 individuals are going to be prosecuted for offenses such as homicide, extortion, and a number of other crimes. And those trials will go forward and come to a conclusion. And after that, you will be able to make a judgment of whether it has been appropriate or not, on the basis of the evidence that's presented and the judgments that are made.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Ward Elcock, for joining me on the telecast and sharing your views on this very sensitive issue that obviously has forced India to sever its ties with Canada. On that note, I slip into a short break. Thanks for watching NewsX.